Thank you, Professor Balcerowicz, for
pleasure is mine
for having time. You are very well known in Russia, and I think in most of post-Soviet countries as the founding father of Polish economic reforms, which were the inspiration for many reformists, reformer governments in post-Soviet Union, in Russia as well as in Ukraine.
It just so happened that Poland was the first former socialist country to move with the reforms in 1989.
Yeah, and actually you had that experience approximately 2 years before Russia started.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yes.
And can we, looking at that history from now, say that actually Poland succeeded, but unlike Poland, Russia and Ukraine were absolutely not successful with economic reforms of 90s, or it's more or less simplification?
Well, I can speak about Poland. And then one can make comparisons with some other countries. What helped was that we have a tragic economic situation. Hyperinflation in 89, 90, it was 500%. We were a bankrupt country, meaning that we could not serve the foreign debt, which was incurred by the previous government, and output was falling. But Poland became politically free about in the middle of 1989, but there were not many volunteers to take care of economic situation. And it so happened that one of my hobbies or mission as a then young man, starting in 1970, it was to think about economic reforms. I formed an informal group of then young people, which I gathered.
You say hobbies.
Hobbies or mission.
I don't call it work.
It was modern work. It was a hobby or mission, but it was voluntary, informal. So in the 80s, the maximum we thought was politically feasible in the economy was to have a sort of Yugoslav system, but more open, more free markets. Why? Because of the presence of the Soviet Union. Now, when the martial law in Poland was introduced in December 89, I stopped being realistic, and my group, I formed an informal group, started to work on most fundamental economic reforms, like economic freedom, privatization, stabilization, etc. So by accident, we are more or less prepared when the first non-communist government in Poland was formed in the summer of '89. And as I said, there was no problem with finding the candidate for the Minister of Finance, Foreign Minister, Culture, etc. But there was a shortage of candidates to tackle.
How old were you?
Well, let me think, 42, not quite young. So I was approached by a colleague of Tadeusz Mazowiecki, the first Prime Minister, to take care of the economy. And when I met him, he said he's looking for his, as he said, Ludwig Erhard. Now I studied Western German experience, and I knew in Poland the situation was much more tragic and serious. I first refused, not because of that, some other reasons that he asked me to reconsider. I agreed. Why did I agree? First, because by accident, as I said, I did some homework, and second, I have a team with whom I work. Without a team, I would never agree. So we moved as a team to take key positions in the Minister of Finance and other key ministers. And because, as I said, the economic situation in Poland was tragic, there was a realization that we have to move fast to have radicals. And this is what I try to do, and I do at the end of 1989. So this first package was massive liberalization and very decisive, radical stabilization, meaning putting down inflation, and the start of institutional change, which took more time, meaning privatization, which was absolutely the key, but it takes more time than just stabilizing the economy. Some other reforms included convertibility of Polish zloty.
And when did you first meet Yegor Gaidar or Anatoly Chubais, who soon had to become some kind of your pupils?
I remember I went to Moscow, I think in 1991.
After the putsch?
Yes, this was after the putsch, that's correct. And I remember I met then President Boris Yeltsin and Russian reformers. And we were like brothers in ideological sense. So there were no disagreements. There was more or less the common thinking that economic reforms have to be fast and comprehensive.
Were they taking your example? Were they asking for some advice? Were they following your
well,
path?
They made some independent studies and research, but certainly as knowledgeable people, they look at the experience of the first country which introduced radical and comprehensive reforms. But they made broader studies, certainly. They were very knowledgeable.
But the biggest difference, I think, between your reforms and the Polish experience and what happened in Russia is the creation of such a new phenomena as oligarchs. Russian government of reformists decided not to allow foreign capital to come to the country.
You know, Poland was lucky enough not to have oil and gas, because this poisons oil and gas, abundant resources of these poison politics. A huge temptation to rely on that. So we were fortunate, devoid of these natural resources. We have only coal, but was declining. So we could not count on this. I think this was something which distinguished Poland from Russia.
But you made that deliberate decision to allow foreigners to participate in the Polish economy.
Massive liberalization included external liberalization, and also, it was also a part of a support of the program which was supported by the West and Western institutions, including IMF, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank. I am not saying this was imposed. I thought that I still think that foreign direct investment in Polish economy was very important as a force for modernization.
But was that the initial sin of Russian reforms, as well as, for example, Ukrainian reforms? Because Ukraine followed that Russia's path, not to allow foreigners to come, and that led to the creation of oligarchs. That led to the corruption.
Well, this is certainly one of the reasons between Poland and then Russia and Ukraine. I think the extent of initial liberalization, meaning enlarged economic freedom, was larger in Poland than in Russia or Ukraine, and this allowed not only foreign capital, but also domestic private capital to expand. And this was crucial both for the economy, but also for politics, because new people entered both economy and politics. And we avoided oligarchs, this problem of politically connected oligarchs, as I said, partly because we did not have abundant oil and gas, but also because of the radical nature of the initial program.
I spoke to former members of Gaidar's government many times, and some of them are complaining about the lack of support from the West. They are saying that they were hoping for some kind of Marshall Plan for Russia, as for Germany after the Second World War, after Russia lost the Cold War, it deserved, or they hoped for some kind of Marshall Plan and a huge financial support for Russia. And they didn't get it. What do you think about that?
I think domestic factors in Russia were decisive, and not no amount of external help would substitute for more pro-reform mobilization in Russia, even though more support would make life in Russia easier. But this is just my guess, educated guess.
So you think that it's not West to blame or America to blame for the lack of success of Russia's reform, but like Russian authorities?
This is my guess. And also remember, as I said, that Russia has abundant oil and gas, so sources of money, which we did not have in Poland. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, as I said, we were a bankrupt country. So without this Western support was a support for radical reforms in Poland. Mm-hmm. Without these radical reforms, I don't think we would get so much support. But the radical reforms were not done because of Western support, but because I thought, and my colleagues thought, and the first government, that this is the best for Poland. Mm-hmm. Very risky, but the best. I thought, and I still think, based on the comparative research, that if we have launched more gradual reforms, you would fail. It was like putting fire slowly. Mm-hmm. You never succeed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And was the Western help sufficient for that period?
It was sufficient in the sense that we succeeded, but we succeeded not mostly because of this help, but because of the comprehensive radical nature of initial economic reforms, which were, of course, criticized by many people, but were popular enough to prevail. As most of radical economic reformers, I was attacked by some politicians. But in 1997, when I entered politics, I won elections in Silesia, which was not my district. Mm-hmm.
So correct me if I'm wrong, there is the stereotype that after your reforms, you have become popularly one of the most hated people in Poland. But it seems that, is it the exaggeration? Or how was it felt by you?
It was not a problem because first of all, I knew that what I was trying to do was necessary for Poland. Second, it was not massive. Of course, some opponents were very vocal, but I never considered them as representative of a Polish population. And I have many supporters in the Polish society. As I said, one of the manifestations of that I won free elections in '97 after this negative propaganda. Mm-hmm. But most importantly, once I decided to be responsible for Poland reforms, I knew that the choice is between very risky and hopeless. So very risky is always better than hopeless option. And hopeless options, as I said already, would be to go slowly. It would fail, and then you would have to start again in much worse economic and political situation. So very risky, meaning what was sometimes called shock therapy, was better.
Mm-hmm. One more very important parallel between Poland in the 90s and Russia in the 90s was some kind of potential restoration. In 1995, Lech Walesa lost the presidential election, and former communist Alexander Kwasniewski won the presidential election. And that was seen from Russia as the nightmare scenario. And the perspective of Yeltsin losing to communist candidate was considered to be the end of the world for Russian media, most of all for Russian reformers, for Russian Democrats. What do you think about that approach?
Maybe in Poland, I can comment on the Polish situation. First of all, Polish communists were not truly communists. Remember, this was to some extent imposed upon Poland, and Kwasniewski, whom I knew and I met as a president, when I was for the second time deputy prime minister in 1997, has signed most of radical bills which we have prepared. Lech Walesa has lost, he is a Polish hero, but he was not the best campaigner. And I think this was the decisive factor. Then he has lost. But he's a living legend in Poland. People appreciate his role.
But you know that in Russia there was a lot of the campaign of '96 was very untransparent. Let's put it mildly. It was there was a lot of suspicion, a lot of talks that it was financed by the state budget. It was supported by oligarchs. So it was far from being free and fair. Even though probably there was no fraud in the process of counting other ballots, the whole campaign was obviously a shame. But it was justified by the fact that, okay, even it's better to have that shameful campaign and shameful victory, but with democratic winner, rather than to allow communists to come back. And for many commentators who look at that history from today's point of view, that was some kind of very bad turning point. Many Russians stopped believing in free and fair elections, in democracy, if Democrats organize the elections that way.
I can't comment on that because you know better what was happening in Russia than I could. No, I can only say that we fortunately have avoided this kind of problems because the successive election campaign were rather clean. And there were no credible accusation of illegal finance of political campaigns, but this is not because we are better exposed than the Russians. It is because you have oligarchs, and you have much more money to be spent on sometimes dirty politics than we could. If you were in your situation, we would have the same problems. So I would rather say it is objective factors given, which influence the different political paths to some extent, at least.
You know, yeah, that's in a way that's all because of the curse of oil and gas, but also it's about the decisions that real people make, and people have choices, they have alternatives, and they make some decisions. And for example, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if it's appropriate to ask that question. I guess you are not the millionaire. Are you?
No, I am not. No, in terms of Polish zlotys, yes, okay. But then many people are millionaires in Poland.
Yeah. But we know that quite a lot of members of Russian reformist government happen to become millionaires after resigning from the government. Until now, many of them have very outstanding way of life, which undermines their credibility because their reforms were not really successful. Some of them acknowledge that, they admit that, but then you see that they seem to be very successful personally, and it gives very bad aftertaste of.
So I can only note that this is one of the differences, which could be largely explained by different temptations and possibilities to earn money not in a very honest way. We did not have these possibilities in Poland because, as I said, we did not have oil and gas, and also I think solidarity movement, which preceded Poland's transformation, and was very important, was very watchful to avoid corruption, political corruption.
And yeah, obviously, Russian reformers didn't have that moral authority and that watchdog. But am I right that you have never been in direct contact? You were not that close to Russian reformists, and they were not really asking you for advice on.
I remember my visit in Moscow. I think it was at the end of '91 when I met Boris Yeltsin and my colleagues, reformers, and I knew that quite understandably they were watching what was happening in Poland because we were like a laboratory. And our views, as I remember, was very similar, that you have to move fast and to introduce comprehensive reforms, I think, more or less.
Was it your only contact or the most important contact?
At that time, it was because I was so busy with Poland's reforms that I could not very often travel to Russia. But we were in touch in other ways.
As former head of central bank and successful head of central bank for many years,
for 6 years, I was. Once I resigned from party politics, I was elected the chairman of Poland's central bank. That's true.
Do you follow what's happening with Elvira Nabiullina and her policy as of head of Russian central bank right now?
Not exactly, but I understand that inflation in Russia is not higher than what is in the Eurozone. So this what comes to my mind.
She's praised for being rather effective in trying to not to let Russian economy collapse, and especially she was praised during the first months of the invasion that she helped to save Russian economy, and that's why it's a very important, I think, moral dilemma. A lot of Russian liberals and Russian Democrats discuss right now. So it's very ironic that many people from the school of Zygar, many followers of Russian reformists, like Minister of Finance or head of central bank of current Russia, are working for Putin. So they started as reformists and Democrats, and now they are serving to that regime.
Well, in the sense that they have accepted nominations, but once they have accepted nominations, for example, the central bank, then their responsibility is to bring down inflation, to care about stability of money, and this is not done for Putin, it is done for the Russians, because it's better to have low inflation than high inflation. So I wouldn't blame them for taking care of something which is important for the people. In this case, this disciplined monetary policy and low inflation. So, and we have under the former communist rule in Poland some people who accepted government jobs in then existing establishment and tried to do a good job for people, and we don't blame them. For example, one of my predecessors in 1988, his name was Wilczek, he largely removed obstacles to private activity in Poland. And he was praised, and I praised him. I acknowledged that he was a precursor of Poland's reforms. I also worked together, the central banker in Poland, the head of central bank, was a former secretary of the Polish Communist Party, Władysław Bakar, and he remained because we respected his term, and we cooperated with them. So some people which were members or even members of the high echelon of Communist Party were professionals, in the Polish case, at least.
So you mean there is no, that's the personal idea that many Russian bureaucrats or businessmen who remain in Russia, they say that yes, we have to do that to support the people. But ideologically, there is no contradiction between free market economy and dictatorship.
Well, in a sense that you can find examples of dictatorships which were free market, Pinochet in Chile. But I am not praising that. I'm not only responding to your question. That, for time being, it is possible to combine a dictatorship, which is bad for the people, with free market. But the worst dictatorship were always communist. What remains? Cuba, North Korea, some other countries, because they are economically bad and very bad from the humanitarian point of view.
Is Russia's economy still a market economy or much more military economy right now?
Well, you know better, but from what I can read, first of all, the share of the state sector is pretty large, and the state sector is subject to political influence. And second, militarization is proceeding, which one can read in connection, and this is of course in connection with the aggression of Russia, Putin's Russia against Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. It reminds quite a lot the Soviet economy, because everything is working for the sake of the military industry. Everything is like the main meaning of the economy is to support the army. So
in this respect, yes, and the Soviet Union ended badly because of militarization and economic decline vis-à-vis the West. And from what I can read, to some extent, it's happening in Russia, Putin's Russia. And so, of course, there's one difference. Putin's Russia has a big, powerful ally, which is China. Mm-hmm. And China is playing a very bad role, I think, in geopolitics, supporting autocracy like Putin's, but not only him, in Africa. Mm-hmm. They are playing a very bad role in supporting bad regimes.
Mm-hmm. Why don't international sanctions work mostly against Putin's regime?
That's a general problem, how harsh the sanctions would have to be in order to have a chance to be effective. This is an empirical question. Second, perhaps it takes time. Third, sanctions cannot fully substitute for domestic resistance or signs of dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm. And so the question is then, do they work at all? Is there any example?
Well, compared to no sanctions, mm-hmm. if there were no sanctions, they would be considered as a sign of approval for a very bad regime. So it's better to have sanctions, even if they are not immediately effective, mm-hmm. than to have no sanctions against bad regimes, like Putin's regime.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm trying to talk a lot to people who live in Russia, just to get the information, the feeling of what's happening inside their brains. And a lot of them sometimes tell that in some way broader sanctions from the West pushed many representatives of Russian business towards Putin. So a lot of people, in the beginning of the war, a lot of people were going to flee, to go to the West, to start supporting Ukraine, but their bank accounts were frozen, their businesses were taken away in the West, including, I heard several stories about Poland, that Polish authorities have taken away some, I don't know, factories from Russian businessmen, and they went back to Russia and had to support Putin. So
I don't know this case. I am not denying that it could take place, but I can't comment on that because it was
I'm more or less
very visible in the Polish media.
The principle. Yeah. I mean, in principle, instead of trying to split Russian elite and to attract all Putin's enemies, in a way, Russian business was consolidated and was pushed back to Putin.
But then we are again back at the question, what would be better, no sanctions or some sanctions? And as I said, let me repeat that if the West did not react with sanctions, this would be taken in the Western countries and also in Russia as a sign of acceptance of a very bad, aggressive politics and policies of Putin, aggression against Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So one has to compare, to judge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and As you were working a lot in Ukraine, and you know a lot about, you were advising to former President Poroshenko?
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, probably it's hard to imagine how the post-war Ukrainian economy could work. But what are your expectations for Ukrainian economy?
Once the war stops and the threat of further Russian invasion disappears, I don't see any logical or empirical problem in putting forth a program which would lead to the restoration of Ukrainian economy, of course from the much lower level because of the aggression. And like in medicine, first diagnosis, and then therapy based on the best experience. Diagnosis would include how massive were the destructions done by the war. Then what should be privatized? State sector does not work in the economy, so in what way? And also stabilization. So fiscal deficit, which is of course now very large. I am not criticizing that because Ukrainian economy has shrunk because of the Russian aggression, but they have to spend on the war. So one would need a combination of a comprehensive radical program plus Western assistance. To some extent, like it was in Poland in 1989-90, but in probably more dramatic economic situation than in Poland then.